There comes a moment in every life when you realize that carrying everything alone is slowly breaking you. The weight of bills, decisions, fear, expectations, and uncertainty presses down on your spirit until your strength feels exhausted. And it is in that moment when you reach the end of yourself that God invites you to place your needs into His hands. Giving your needs to God does not mean you stop working. It means you stop worrying. It means you recognize that human effort has limits, but divine provision does not. God never asked you to carry what He already promised to handle. He asked you to trust. Many people pray, but they never release. They ask God for help, yet continue to hold on to anxiety as if fear were a form of responsibility. Worry is not preparation. It is unbelief disguised as caution. When you give your needs to God, you exchange anxiety for peace, pressure for purpose, and fear for faith. God already knows what you need before you open your mouth. He knows the struggle you don't talk about. He sees the bills you stare at in silence. He understands the tears you wipe away so no one notices. And still, He asks you to come, not because He needs information, but because relationship requires trust. When you surrender your needs, you surrender control. And control is the hardest thing for the human heart to release. We want answers now. We want solutions instantly. We want certainty before obedience. But God often asks you to move before you see, to believe before you receive, and to trust before you understand. God's provision does not always arrive early, but it is never late. It shows up at the exact moment your faith is ready to grow. Waiting is not punishment, it is preparation. In the waiting season, God strengthens your character, deepens your dependence, and teaches you that He alone is your source. Some needs God meets instantly. Others He meets daily. He gives daily bread, so you keep coming back. So trust becomes a lifestyle rather than a moment. When you rely on God one day at a time, fear loses grip and faith becomes your foundation. Giving your needs to God also means accepting that His answers may look different from your expectations. Sometimes God says yes. Sometimes He says wait. Sometimes He says no, not to hurt you, but to protect you. God sees consequences you do not yet understand. When you obey God, even while waiting, provision begins to move. Obedience is the language faith speaks. Gratitude is the atmosphere where miracles grow. When you thank God in advance, you declare that lack does not define you. Faith does. Silence from God does not mean absence. Even when you cannot feel Him, He is working. Even when doors remain closed, He is redirecting. Trust is proven not when prayers are answered quickly, but when faith remains steady in uncertainty. The moment you give your needs to God, peace enters your life, not because everything changes instantly, but because you are no longer alone. God becomes your provider and your protector, your sustainer, and your strength. When God is your source, fear has no authority. When God is your provider, lack has no voice. When God carries your needs, your soul can finally rest. So today, release what you have been holding. Lay down the burden. Stop fighting alone. Give your needs to God and watch how faith replaces fear, peace replaces pressure, and provision replaces worry. Before a single word forms on your lips, before you bow your head in prayer, before you even understand what you are feeling, God already knows your needs. Nothing in your life surprises Him. There is no request that catches God off guard and no situation that causes Him to panic. What feels overwhelming to you has already been seen, understood, and accounted for by Him. Many people hesitate to come to God because they think they need the right words or the perfect prayer. But God is not moved by eloquence. He is moved by sincerity. He knows the needs you struggle to explain, the burdens you try to hide, and the fears you pretend do not exist. Even when your prayers are silent, your heart is speaking and God is listening. God's knowledge of your needs is not distant or cold. It is deeply personal. He knows what you need emotionally, spiritually, physically, and mentally. He knows what you need right now, and He knows what you will need in the future. While you see only today's struggle, God sees the full picture of your life. He understands how today's pain connects to tomorrow's purpose. This truth should bring comfort, not complacency. Knowing that God already understands your new needs removes the pressure of having to explain everything perfectly. You are not informing God, you are trusting Him. Prayer becomes less about convincing God to act and more about aligning your heart with His will. When you truly believe that God already knows your needs, fear begins to lose its power, anxiety fades when you realize that your situation is not out of control. It is in God's hands. You may not have all the answers, but God does. You may not see the way forward, but God does. And because He knows, you can rest. God's awareness of your needs also means He is not limited by timing. He is already ahead of you, preparing provision before the need fully arises. While you are worrying about tomorrow, God is already there, making a way. What feels delayed to you is often divinely timed by Him. Trust grows when you accept that God's knowledge is complete and His care is intentional. You are never forgotten, never overlooked, and never ignored. Even when your prayers feel weak or repetitive, God understands the deeper cry behind them. He knows your needs before you speak. And that knowledge is wrapped in love, wisdom, and perfect care. Prayer was never meant to be an act of desperation where you plead with God as if He were reluctant to help you. Prayer is not about convincing God to care because His love was established long before you ever asked. When you pray, you are not begging for attention. You are placing your trust in the one who already desires your good. Many people approach prayer with fear, repeating the same words over and over as if persistence alone will force a breakthrough. But true prayer is not about pressure, it is about confidence. It is the quiet assurance that God hears you, understands you, and is willing to respond according to His wisdom. Trust replaces anxiety when you realize that God does not need to be persuaded, He needs to be believed. Prayer is an expression of dependence. When you pray, you are acknowledging that you cannot do everything on your own and that you are willing to rely on God's strength instead of your own. This is not weakness. Trust grows when you stop trying to control outcomes and allow God to guide the process. Begging focuses on fear. Trust focuses on faith. Begging assumes God might withhold. Trust knows God provides. When you pray in trust, you release the outcome into God's hands. You speak honestly, then you rest, believing that whatever God decides will ultimately work for your good. Prayer also changes you before it changes circumstances. As you trust God through prayer, your perspective shifts. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel manageable. What once caused panic begins to produce peace. Trusting prayer aligns your heart with God's timing and prepares you to receive His answer, whether it comes quickly or requires patience. When prayer becomes trusting, it becomes consistent. You no longer pray only in emergencies, you pray as a way of life. Your trust removes the pressure to perform and replaces it with relationship. You come to God not as a desperate stranger, but as a child confident in the care of a loving Father. In trusting prayer, you stop measuring God's faithfulness by immediate results. You begin to understand that God's silence is not rejection and delay is not denial. Trust allows you to keep praying even when answers are unseen because faith is anchored not in outcomes, but in who God is. Worry often feels like responsibility, but in truth, it is a signal that you are holding on to something God never intended you to carry alone. When your mind is constantly racing, replaying worst case scenarios and struggling to find rest, it is not because you care too much. It is because you are trying to manage what belongs in God's hands. Worry reveals misplaced ownership. God invites you to release your burdens, not just acknowledge them. Many people pray and still worry because they never truly let go. They hand their problems to God in prayer, then pick them back up through anxiety. But trust cannot coexist with constant fear. The more you worry, the more you are attempting to control outcomes that are beyond your power. Worry drains your strength without producing solutions. It consumes energy but creates no progress. While concern can lead to action, worry leads only to exhaustion. God never asked you to figure everything out. He asked you to believe that He already has. When you continue to worry, you are silently saying you trust your fear more than God's promise. Carrying worry also affects your spiritual clarity. Fear clouds judgment and narrows vision. It keeps you focused on problems instead of possibilities. When you release worry, space is created for faith to grow. Peace begins where control ends. Letting go does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop obsessing over what you cannot change. God understands your concerns, but He does not want you imprisoned by them. He invites you to exchange anxiety for peace, pressure for purpose. Releasing worry is an act of obedience. It requires daily surrender because fear often tries to return. Each time it does, you are given a choice to carry the weight again or to trust God in you. Worry makes you feel alone, but trust reminds you that God is present and active. When you release what you cannot handle, you allow God to do what only He can. That peace does not come from having answers. It comes from knowing who is in control. Faith cannot fully develop in a heart that insists on controlling everything. As long as you believe you must manage every outcome, faith remains limited. Control creates the illusion of security, but it also creates distance from God. True faith begins when you accept that your strength has limits and God's power does not. Surrendering control is difficult because it requires trust without guarantees. You are asked to believe even when outcomes are uncertain and paths are unclear. But faith is not built in certainty. It is built in surrender. Every time you release control, you make room for God to move in ways you could not achieve on your own. And many people say they trust God, yet struggle to let go of how and when things should happen. They trust God with the destination, but insist on driving the road. Faith grows when you allow God to lead, even when His direction challenges your comfort or understanding. Obedience becomes an act of trust rather than a strategy for control. Surrender does not mean passivity. It means active trust. You do what you can while believing God will do what you cannot. Letting go of control frees your mind from constant pressure and opens your heart to peace. Faith strengthens when you realize that God is not asking you to predict the future, only to trust Him with it. Every season of surrender deepens faith. When you release control over timing, outcomes, and expectations, your dependence on God increases. That dependence is not weakness, it is spiritual maturity. Faith grows not because circumstances improve, but because your trust in God becomes stronger than your need to control. When control is surrendered, fear loses its grip. You stop reacting out of panic and start responding out of faith. Trust replaces tension. Peace replaces striving. Faith becomes less about results and more about relationship. When answers do not come when you expect them, it is easy to assume that God is delaying or ignoring your needs. But God does not operate on human schedules. What feels late to you is often perfectly aligned with what He is doing behind the scenes. God's timing is guided by wisdom, not urgency, and by purpose, not pressure. Waiting is one of the most challenging parts of faith because it forces you to trust without visible progress. In the waiting, doubt tries to speak louder than faith. Yet God often uses delay to develop patience, maturity, and deeper trust. If God answered everything immediately, faith would never grow and character would never be refined. God sees the full picture while you see only the moment. He understands how one decision affects another, how one season prepares you for the next. What you want now may not be what you need most. God's timing protects from outcomes you are not yet ready to handle. Delay does not mean denial. It means preparation. God may be aligning people, circumstances, or opportunities that must come together at the right moment. While you wait, God works. While you feel stuck, God is moving. His silence does not mean inactivity. It means intentionality. Trusting God's timing requires faith that goes beyond emotions. It requires believing that God cares enough to say, wait, even when waiting is uncomfortable. When you stop rushing God and start resting in His timing, peace begins to replace frustration. God's perfect timing teaches you to rely on Him rather than your own impatience. It shifts your focus from immediate results to long long-term purpose. When the answer finally comes, you realize it arrived exactly when it was meant to. Peace does not come from having everything under control. It comes from placing everything into God's hands. As long as you hold tightly to your burdens, your heart remains restless. But the moment you release them to God, something shifts inside you. The situation may remain the same, yet your spirit becomes calmer because peace is not tied to circumstances. It is tied to trust. When you place your needs, fears, and uncertainties in God's hands, you are acknowledging that His care is greater than your concern. God's hands are steady, capable, and faithful. What feels fragile in your hands becomes secure in His. You may not understand how He will work things out, but peace comes from knowing that He will. Many people seek peace by changing external situations, but true peace begins internally. It is the result of surrender, not control. When you stop carrying what God is willing to carry for you, your mind is freed from constant tension. The weight lifts, not because the problem disappears, but because you are no longer facing it alone. Placing something in God's hands also requires consistency. Fear has a way of returning, and when it does, peace is challenged. Each time anxiety tries to take over, you are invited to release the burden again. Peace grows stronger as trust becomes a habit rather than a moment. God's peace guards your heart and mind when you surrender fully. It allows you to rest even in uncertainty and remain steady during difficulty. When your life is entrusted to God, chaos loses its power and calm takes its place. What you place in God's hands does not always change immediately, but it is always cared for, and in that care, peace takes root and grows. Weakness is often seen as something to hide, but in God's design, weakness becomes an invitation for His strength to appear. When you reach the limits of your ability, you arrive at the place where God's power becomes most visible. God does not wait for you to be strong enough. He steps in when you are honest enough to admit you are not. Many people exhaust themselves trying to appear capable, independent, unshaken. But pretending to be strong only delays the help God is ready to give. Acknowledging weakness is not failure, it is humility. It is the moment you stop relying solely on yourself and begin relying on God. God's strength is not added to your ability. It replaces your insufficiency. When you admit you cannot handle something on your own, you create space for divine intervention. God works most powerfully where pride steps aside and trust takes its place. Your weakness becomes the doorway through which God's grace enters. In moments of weakness, God provides endurance, clarity, and peace that cannot be produced by human effort. He strengthens your heart when your emotions are overwhelmed and steadies your mind when fear tries to take control. What you lack in energy, confidence, or understanding, God supplies in strength, wisdom, and reassurance. Weakness also deepens your relationship with God. It teaches you dependence and keeps you grounded in faith. When you experience God carrying you through what you could not survive alone, your trust in Him grows stronger. God does not shame weakness, He uses it. When you stop fighting your limitations and start trusting God with them, His strength begins to work in ways that transform struggle into endurance and fear into faith. God's provision is often given one day at a time, and not all at once. This is intentional. By providing daily bread instead of lifetime storage, God teaches you to rely on Him consistently rather than occasionally. Dependence on God is not meant to be a one-time decision. It is meant to be a daily posture of trust. Many people want certainty for the future before they feel secure in the present. They want answers, resources, and guarantees far in advance. But God knows that too much security can weaken faith. When everything is supplied up front, trust fades. Daily provision keeps your heart connected to God and your focus anchored in the present. God's daily provision meets your current needs, not imagined fears about tomorrow. Anxiety often comes from trying to live in a future that has not arrived. God invites you to trust Him for today. Believe that tomorrow will be handled when it comes. Each day carries its own grace, and that grace is sufficient for that day alone. Receiving daily bread also requires humility. It means accepting that you cannot control every outcome and that you must return to God again and again. This rhythm of dependence strengthens faith and deepens relationship. Each day you see God provide, your confidence in Him grows. Daily provision teaches gratitude. When you receive what you need today, you learn to appreciate it rather than overlook it. Small blessings become meaningful and faith becomes steady. You stop chasing excess and start trusting sufficiency. God's method of daily provision keeps you grounded, present, and faithful. It reminds you that He is not only your future hope, but your present source, sustaining you moment by moment. Fear has a way of quietly taking control of the mind and heart if it is not confronted. It does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it enters through doubt, hesitation, or overthinking. When fear is allowed to remain, it begins to block faith, limiting your ability to trust God fully. Fear and faith cannot occupy the same space for long. One will always weaken the other. Fear focuses on what could go wrong, while faith focuses on who is in control. When fear dominates, your decisions are driven by self-protection rather than trust. You begin to avoid risks, resist change, and question God's promises. Fear convinces you that obedience is dangerous and that surrender will lead to loss. Letting go of fear does not mean pretending it does not exist. It means refusing to let fear have authority over your choices. Faith grows when you acknowledge fear but choose to trust God anyway. Each step taken in faith weakens fear's grip and strengthens your confidence in God's guidance. Fear also distorts perception. It magnifies problems and minimizes God's power. When fear controls your thinking, obstacles appear larger than they truly are. Releasing fear allows you to see clearly and remember that God is greater than any challenge you face. Faith requires courage, and courage is not the absence of fear, it is movement despite it. When you let go of fear, you make room for faith to act. Trust replaces panic, and peace replaces anxiety. Fear loses its influence when faith becomes your foundation. Choosing faith over fear is a daily decision. Fear may return, but each time you release it, faith grows stronger and more resilient. Faith without action is incomplete. God's provision is often tied to obedience. When you follow His instructions, even when they are challenging or unclear, you open the door for blessings and resources to flow. Obedience is not just a spiritual duty. It is a practical pathway to experiencing God's power and favor in your life. Many people pray for breakthrough yet resist taking steps God asks of them. They want results without responsibility, answers without alignment, and blessings without action. But God's provision works hand in hand with obedience. Your willingness to act demonstrates trust, and trust invites God to respond. Obedience often requires moving before seeing the full picture. It may call for sacrifice, patience, or stepping into the unknown. When you obey God's guidance, you position yourself to receive what cannot be earned or forced. Provision is not just about material needs. It can also include guidance, wisdom, opportunities, and spiritual growth. Sometimes obedience challenges pride. It asks you to submit your plans to God's plan, your timing to His timing, and your understanding to His wisdom. Yet each act of submission activates provision because it signals that you believe God's way is better than your own. Obedience also cultivates consistency. Small, faithful actions often lead to significant results over time. God honors steadfastness more than grand gestures done sporadically. Provision is often released incrementally, building momentum as you continue to act. And finally, obedience transforms waiting into opportunity. While you wait for answers or breakthroughs, your obedience ensures that you are not stagnant, but actively aligned with God's purpose. Each step taken in faith triggers unseen blessings, moving you closer to the fulfillment of your needs. One of the most important lessons in faith is understanding the difference between needs and wants. God's provision is designed to meet what is necessary for your growth, survival, and purpose, not every desire that crosses your mind. While your wants may seem urgent or essential, God prioritizes what truly sustains your life and aligns with His plan. Many people struggle because they expect God to fulfill their every desire immediately. When those desires are not met, disappointment sets in and faith weakens. And yet God's wisdom far surpasses human understanding. He sees the long-term consequences of giving everything you want, and He knows what is genuinely beneficial versus what may only offer temporary satisfaction. God meets needs in ways that often teach lessons, build character, or prepare you for greater responsibilities. A need met may come with growth opportunities or experiences that shape your future, while a want met without discernment can lead to stagnation or harm. God's provision is intentional, and His understanding of your true needs is far deeper than your own. Trusting God to meet needs requires patience and humility. It requires believing that even when you do not receive what you hope for, God is still at work on your behalf. Needs are not always about comfort. They are about life, purpose, and spiritual alignment. Recognizing the difference between needs and wants also encourages gratitude. When God provides what you truly require, you learn to value sustenance over indulgence and purpose over preference. Each fulfilled need becomes a testimony of God's faithfulness, reinforcing that He is reliable and loving. Finally, this understanding shifts your perspective in prayer. Instead of focusing on every desire, you learn to seek God's guidance, trust His timing, and embrace the provision that aligns with His wisdom. Meeting needs, not wants, reminds you that God is not limited by human expectations. He is orchestrating your life with perfect care. As we come to the close of this message, remember this: God is not distant. He is not indifferent. He sees, He knows, and He cares. Every worry, every fear, every need you carry is already before Him. He is inviting you to release what you cannot carry and trust Him with what you cannot control. Giving your needs to God is more than a moment. It is a lifestyle. It is choosing faith over fear, trust over anxiety, and obedience over hesitation. It is waking up each day knowing that no burden is too heavy, no situation too complex, and no fear too strong for the God who holds all things together. Today, decide to let go. Lay down what you have been trying to manage alone. Stop carrying the weight of worry, doubt, and fear. Place your needs into God's hands and step into the peace He offers. Trust His timing, embrace His provision, and rely on His strength. When you give your needs to God, you invite His presence, power, and peace into your life. You discover that lack loses its grip, fear loses its voice, and faith finds its wings. Your journey does not become free from challenges, but it becomes filled with God's guidance, protection, and provision every step of the way. So today, surrender fully, trust completely, obey faithfully. Let God show you that when your needs are His responsibility, your heart can finally rest. Your peace, your provision, and your purpose are waiting. But only when you choose to give your needs to God.